I do.
Kind of emergencies.
Yeah, Ruth, the people in my department know this, but there's a peanut butter pretzel stash in my office, which means that if you didn't have time to have lunch, you can always eat peanut butter pretzels and hope that your heartburn doesn't kill you later.
Now I know this. I'm going to be over there, obviously.
It needs topping up, though.
That's true. I'm low on peanut butter pretzels, and Josephine is my peanut butter pretzel trafficker. She buys them at Costco.
I am indeed, and will be updating next week.
I think there are days when there would be no calories in my body were it not for the peanut butter pretzel stash. So, because I don't think coffee has calories, right? I don't think I should know this by this point, but you know, such is life. Okay, well, maybe we should get ourselves started and go from there. First, everybody, welcome to the Gender Institute Scholar of the Month presentation. We will record this, but if you don't want to be in the recording, just let us know. We do edit them before we post them anywhere. So if there's a question or comment or something that you have that you either want to see before it goes up or don't want to go up, I just unceremoniously take big chunks out of videos, mostly of my talking, but I also help other people. So just know that anything that you say does not necessarily have to ever see the light of day again. But we do want to make sure that we are able to share this awesome talk with our YouTube audience and future students and things like that as well. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our Scholar of the Month this month. Scholar of the Month. This is the sort of thing I edit out. Scholar of the Month this month, Man-Hua Lee, who joined Royal Holloway in 2022 as Marie Curie Research Fellow in Philosophy. Previously, she obtained her PhD in philosophy at École Normale Supérieure de Paris. And her research spans areas of the history of philosophy, global and Chinese philosophy, and philosophies of genders and sexualities. Her upcoming monograph in French, Le Corps Esthétique, will be published in September of 2023 by Editions Kimi in Paris, and an English version, The Aesthetic Body, will be out soon. She's now working on her second monograph entitled On Self-Cultivation, Reconsidering Nietzsche and Taoism, which argues that cultivating yin-potency, I'm good at pronunciation today, in every human of any gender and any socio-political bodies helps address the pressing issue of well-being and ecology in the global world of today. She will be teaching a course called 1 Week in Chinese Philosophy, Yinyang, the Body and Gender at UCL Summer School in Ancient Philosophy. She's organized 2 conferences in the last couple of months, one on aestheticism and one on the philosophy of self-cultivation, both of which were well attended and well reviewed. Today, she will integrate the philosophy of Yinyang in the discussion of Foucauldian self-care in relation to governmentality and demonstrate that by nourishing life as a form of self-care, we can contribute to a socio-political transformation of processes that depend on flourishing of the hidden, implicit, and imperceptible propensity of the yin-potency. Man-Hua, welcome, and the floor is yours, and I hope I didn't butcher that too badly.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Josephine, for organizing this event for me and to give me such a great honor as the Scholar of June at the Gender Institute. And first, I have the opportunity to share my very recent research project with all of you here who care about, you know, the philosophy of the body and gender and, you know, history of sexuality, so that we can have another perspective of looking at history of philosophy as well as history of, you know, relations between, you know, different types of human beings, let's say, including the European and the Chinese. And so we are going to, I will share my screen first so that you can see my PPT. Yes. And so I've prepared for a 40 minutes talk. So if I'm running out of time, please let me know. And so today I would like to present to you this very recent, project that I have on Yinyang, on the philosophy of bodily technology and erotic arts, as well as governmentality. So it's a project that that's derived from my Marie Curie research fellowship based on Foucauldian care of the self in his late works, especially History of Sexuality, Volume 2 and 3, and also the last one that came up in 2018, so Volume 4 as well. And also Foucault, it will also involve Foucault's talks at the Collège de France, where he elaborates on the idea of governmentality. So I would like to, first of all, give you an overview of Foucault's late thought, and then to guide you towards a critical perspective of Foucault's philosophy through a counter proposition of what I call the yin-yang as a strategy as well as political thought on governmentality. So let's get started. Right. I would like to first introduce you to the idea or the notion of care of the self that finds its provenance in ancient Greek philosophy. So care of the self derives from this Delphic prescriptions that are put up in the Temple of Athens. It's in the form of two different formulations. So gnoti theauton, know thyself, plus egu, so the guarantee of knowledge of the self. And we see in a lot of Platonic writings about Socrates where the notion of this idea of knowing yourself through taking care of yourself. So the guarantee would be take care of the subject in its own capacity of self-control, self-mastery, etc. So in Socrates, especially in Platonistic writings, Socrates actually proposes the notion in a more synthetic form. So heialtou epimelestai, sorry for the accent in Greek. So it's about the Socratic synthetic form of this notion of caring that leads to knowing. So there's an epistemological statement in there. So caring for yourself is actually a prerequirement for knowing truth, which is aletheia in Socrates. And so this form of truth is only attainable if the subject is the master of an art of controlling himself through various practices. For example, we can see in Marcus Aurelius, he writes this book on meditation, and which actually puts himself in constant dialogues with himself about things that happen in a day and things that can't that keep him from asleep in the night. So this kind of self-practice or self-dialogue or contemplation on daily life is actually a very traditional classical way of contemplation and art of self-mastery in the Stoic tradition. And this tradition is very different from the kind of moralistic approach to self-relation. For example, in Kant, we can see that moral law or certain codes are actually the guidance for self-relation and contemplation. And I would like to emphasize here that the Stoic actually takes the example from Socrates, because Socrates is viewed as the very beginning of the tradition of this kind of rationalistic approach to self-mastery. And one of the example I can give you is his relation with his wife, Xanthippe. So Xanthippe is considered as one of the most the hardest woman to get along with in the city of Athens. And this is why Socrates claims that he actually trains himself to be the virtuous person through his marriage to Xanthippe. And well, this kind of statement can already show the kind of virile tendency of this self-mastery techniques, which is about training yourself in control, in order to have control on yourself, but also have control of your household and of your state. So in ancient Greece, we have 3 different types of techniques that engages with this art of self-mastery. For example, there is dietary techniques about what to eat and when to eat, in certain according to the seasonal changes. And secondly, Foucault also emphasizes this economic side of techniques of the self, where you can see the male person is in charge of not only the household, so kind of like governing secretly his wife, his partner, but also governing the public realm of the city. And so I will leave the erotic technique a little bit later on, and just focus on this kind of more rationalistic dimension of the art of mastery of the self. So let's move on to see what specifically Foucault is talking about when he talks about care of the self. So in book 2 of the History of Sexuality, Foucault actually proposes there's 2 kinds of notion of self-mastery, and the first one is sophorsune, so temperance. It's about the subject deliberately choosing principles of action that conform to reason in the happy medium between insensitivity and excesses. And we can all think about, this come from a lot of the texts in Plato, for example. So Plato really emphasizes this kind of more rational way of control, in that you must, guide your action according to a kind of golden mean, and then not to excess or to do insufficiently according to a situation. So, and it's actually a kind of discrimination against the female person in the Athenian city, because institutionally speaking, a female's status of dependence on their families and husbands and the procreative function ensures the permanence of the male citizens' names and the transmission of property and survival of the city. But when it comes to decision making about, what the city needs, or whether we're going to go into war, this kind of, temperance or sophorsune inscribes only in the male capacity, and is regarded that the female is incapable of having this virtue of temperance because of their state of dependence and lack of control. And secondly, there's a structural reference to this kind of discrimination against the female or the feminine, is that in order to be temperate, a woman must establish a relation of superiority and domination with herself, which is in itself of the virile type. So even if in ancient Greek city, such as Athens, a woman has less of a humanhood or personhood than a male citizen, but even if she tries to emulate the master's skill or virtue in order to be temperate or to be more in control of her desires or emotions, she must actually imitate what the master, what the male person does, which is to dominate the desires within him or herself, and in order to dominate the other in the city, or to govern the other through this capacity of getting in control and mastering our desires or irrational needs. So after all, actually, it's Aristotle that points out that this kind of self-mastery is about government, not suppression of desires. So desires are not regarded as evil or related to sin or anything negative, but it's all about having the capacity to get under control, to dominate the desire and be the king, be the master of this desire. And thus the male-female relation is one of the governor versus the governed, because the female obviously is lacking in this power of temperance. And so let's look at the second type of self-mastery. So Foucault has digged out this notion of self-mastery, which is very different from temperance as a rational form of self-mastery or self-care, which is enkrateia. And this is where the subject is on the axis of struggle, resistance, and combat, but not on a deliberate choice. So it's not a result of rational thinking or reason, but somehow it actually serves as the condition for temperance. So what about this self-mastery as self-combat? Foucault has actually deliberately, elaborately talks about enkrateia in the context of aphrodisiac practices. So here is the quote: "The aphrodisia are desirable and necessary by virtue of a play of forces whose origin and purpose are natural, but the virtualities, by virtue of their own energy, lead to revolt and excess. But we must not fight them because of their intrinsic nature, but because of the danger that, taking precedence over everything else, they will extend their domination over the whole individual and ultimately reduce him to slavery." So we actually find such erotic combats between the male persons in the form of this enkrateia, so self-mastery in terms of how you can struggle and fight against this irrational, not irrational, but also natural forces. So aphrodisia is regarded as a natural force that could encompass everything, including the human agency. So once you're taken by the force of aphrodisia, you lose your rationality. So the most famous example of this enkrateia relation would be Socrates and his disciple Alcibiades. So here's a photo of the two. It's famous because Alcibiades is regarded as one of the most handsome boy in Athens, and he is also very attracted to Socrates, who is actually a very ugly and poor philosopher of Athens. So this is quite notorious for the fact that there's this huge contrast between age and then also between the appearances of the subject, but they seem to be engaged in a perfectly elaborated relationship where both of them train themselves in order to have the aphrodisiac desires in control. And so in that kind of combat with the self, as Socrates would say that, in order to control the eros, we need to engage with the other person instead of just staying within one's own personal, one's own subjectivity. So it is here in enkrateia, in the form of aphrodisiac struggle, that we see that the other person come into the picture, and then are also considered within this self-care or self-practice of the subject. And this is also one of the reasons why Foucault treats this as something that is very different from temperance, or the more rational form of self-mastery that we mentioned just now, because it's not only about the rational or the economic function of sex, so which is normally engaged by a female and male person, but also very erotic side of this life, of this aphrodisiac desires, that is actually pre-rational, and that needs us to train ourselves not only in a rational dimension or a logo, or in the dimension of logos, so truth, but also in a dimension that's bodily, that that encompasses, something that's not purely spiritual or rational. So moving on to the further notion of government of the self that derives from care of the self, we'd like to emphasize that self-mastery in the form of self-combat that we mentioned earlier connects the personal with the socio-political. Here's another quote from Foucault. In public, every man is an enemy to every man. In private life, every man is an enemy to himself. So this is another place where Foucault, one of the places where Foucault emphasized that care of the self is not only about the self, because just as we can see in the dynamic relation between Socrates and Alcibiades, we see that it's also about training in order for the other to be the master of himself. It's not only about me as the master of the other person, but also about a cultivation of subjectivity in the other that is temporarily in subjugation, perhaps, or in domination to myself. But in this case, self-mastery does not exclude the fact that it achieves through a form of combat. So just in the public arena, people fight for power. Actually, in the private arena, in the private life, we also fight between the lower level of the self and the higher level of the self. So this combat is always constantly ongoing. And that's why man here, homme, in singular, not only denotes a person, one single person, but also the entire body of citizens who are to govern the city and to be governed by themselves. So after knowing this link between care and government, we move on to look at what's the problem with this kind of analysis. So first, Foucault talks about truth, right? So truth as disclosure of the self, so self-knowledge, but also after that, maybe moving on to the objective realm of reality. But then truth about the self is it's really the focus of aletheia in this instance. And aletheia as truth is accessible on the condition that the subject governs both his desires and his city, right? Such as Marcus Aurelius, who is not only a very successful Stoic philosopher, but also an emperor for the Roman Empire. But Foucault is very clear about the kind of underlying socio-political notion of this aletheia. And I would just skip this quote and move on to another mode of truth that Foucault is really trying to get at when he talks about aletheia. So there is another form of truth or mode of truth that prepares a citizen for government of the self and others. And this kind of truth practice is parrhesia, known as candid speech or frank talk. It's another kind of art of government of the self that takes the body as the theatrical site for plastic manifestation of truth that cannot be verbally uttered. So I take the example of Diogenes. Diogenes is known as one of the notorious cynic that lies in the public space of the Athenian city. And one day he meets Alexander the Great, and he really didn't want to engage in any, political discourse with this powerful emperor. Instead, he actually just put up his hands and indicate that Alexander is in his way because he wanted to enjoy his sunbathe. So this gesture of Diogenes of not engaging in any political dialogue with the powerful is actually in itself a very powerful and rebellious gesture of truth-telling or candid speech. And in that case, Foucault is proposing here a kind of alternative order of truth that is lurking underneath the aletheia that is so visible and so present in the philosophical discourse and political discourse in ancient Greek philosophy that we mentioned as the aletheia that Socrates holds so dear. And so moving on to this truth practice as parousia, that doesn't have to be verbally enunciated, but need to be manifested by your body, by the bodies of people that want to engage in this truth practice. Foucault says that it's a double mission of care, and I interpret it as a double mission of self-combat. So it's about a struggle against oneself and for oneself, against others and for others. It's a struggle that involves endurance of the violence, injustice, and suffering that others bring about. As such, the cynics, so Diogenes, for example, have the function of a scout watching over the concerns of man, a doubling of the concern for oneself, epimeleia. So we see the notion of care appears again in this book. So this is a quote from Le Courage de la Vérité, so The Courage of Truth, where which is also the second volume of Foucault's work, Government of the Self and Others. And so here we can see a merge of the notion of care with the notion of enkrateia, so which means that without engaging in a combat with yourself and with the other person in a city, we can't really have a notion of care, epimeleia, because taking the cynic, Diogenes, as an example, we actually understand care of the self, epimeleia, heiautu, in the form of enkrateia, so self-mastery in terms of struggle against oneself. Even though Foucault is trying to get away from the predominant self-mastery, so as temperance, that actually gets us into becoming this rational subject that rules the state, he actually does not overcome this need for reason by the end of this book, because this also implies an alteration of the world through the creation of a counter-ethos within the world at present, at the cost of an experimental process of subjectivation as desubjectivation, namely the dissolution of the subject constituted in the current world. So here I would like to emphasize the fact that even though Foucault is proposing an alternative form to self-mastery in its more pre-reflective mode and its more bodily mode, such as seen in Diogenes, we can see that this mode of truth practice, or this mode of caring for the self, governing the self, still relies a lot on the truth practice in the form of rational thinking, because actually it's the condition for any type of self-mastery that is at the rational level. And so here is the picture of Diogenes with his dog and with his very modest abode. And we can see that this is one of the less visible corner of Athens and the less powerful minority of the body of citizens that are included in that community. So already Foucault is doing a good job, rather, for bringing out the less visible part of political power and the less visible part of the world that is at present. But I would like to say that I would go more radically in Foucault's own proposition by actually inviting some other variants of self-care that will actually continue in the spirit of parousia without sacrificing parousia to aletheia as this more rationalistic way of practice. So mainly, parousia emphasizes pre-rational self-mastery on kadeya, which conditions temperance, so sophrosune, as a rational form of self-care that guarantees the subject's disclosure of truth through reason. But in its embodiment, Diogenes thus cannot rid himself of the necessity to dominate his own desire or control of his own kingdom in parallel of the city of Athens. So actually Diogenes says to Alexander that he is the king of himself and the king that reigns his own arena. But this arena has nothing to do with the city of Athens. It's a world that he generates, that he creates on his own. He's not reliant upon any institution in Athens. He does not have a military army. He does not have any governmental institutional support, but that precisely manifests his independence of the political order. In the end, this subjectivized self prevails over the desubjectivized, amounting to another version of the Socratic care of the self. Such a self-governing subject insists on a virile and dominant type of care. So even though Diogenes does not care about the government, which is on the more visible side of the city, so the political institutional way of government, he is more caring about the governmentality of his own person as a subject to himself. And in the end, he wants to overcome his own desires for material life, for political power, in order to be the master of his own kingdom. So there is still a very a tendency to dominate and to master in this type of care of the self. So this leads to the Chinese aspect of my research. So I'd like to introduce you to the notion of nourishing life as a possible alternative form of care of the self that arrives in ancient China. It's a notion that's less virile in that it actually favors the more feminine or the less, say, less strong or demanding kind of power. It's all about a practice, a bodily practice that engages with the person, the natural side of life, but also about longevity. So it's a bodily practice that aims for elongating a person's life and taking care of the well-being of the person. And its origin takes place in the classical Taoism that dates back to the 5th to the 3rd century before Christ. So one of the famous classics is the Yellow Emperor's internal medicine. So Huangdi Neijing, this is one of the famous ones. And there is also texts like the Laozi, Dao De Jing, the Zhuangzi, the Huainanzi, etc. So it's about taking care of oneself through spiritual, emotional, and energetic dimensions. And more specifically, I interpret nourishing life as an economy, actually as management of the qi. That is actually, so qi is, you can say, as a symbol of forces or natural forces that we encounter in life, within the person or outside of a person, in nature, in environment. So this kind of forces are normally presenting themselves in the dynamics between yin, potency, and a yang, power or movement. So the yin-yang together constitute elements of the cosmos, and the cosmos is also regarded as a kind of body that is like our own. It functions based on the balance and the dynamics or the interactions between the two forces. It's a matter of self-government for accumulation of qi, for example, through traditional medical treatments, through the organization of living space. So the idea of feng shui, how you design your living space according to the lack of qi or the excess of a certain qi. Or even sexual practices or culinary practices. So let's see what are the germs to discover here. So I would like to talk about this non-present character of the yin-potency, which is obviously in comparison or in contrast to the virility that the ancient Greeks seem to be endearing. So here's a quote from the Tao Te Ching. All the myriad things embody yin and embrace yang, fu yin bao yang. So this means that one actually tends to embrace what is in front and see what is present, the you, and avoid what is the dark, the unseen, the non-present, the wu. Though the nurturing of the non-present conditions the present. So this can be explained through examples such as the seasonal change, which is very difficult or impossible to detect. But any subtle change in temperature, in light, in the strength of wind, actually will affect the cultivation of things. And China, as an agricultural civilization, has paid a lot of attention to how to cultivate things from its very, very original and fragile state. So here is another quote from the Huangdi Neijing that talks about this yin-yang philosophy beyond cultivation. Heaven covers while earth carries, and then the myriad things are generated. If a thing has not yet come out of soil, it is called the place of yin. It is yin within yin. If it comes out of the soil, it is yang within yin. Yang gives straightness while yin is the master. Thus generation relies on spring, growth relies on summer, harvesting relies on autumn, and storing relies on winter. If they lose their consistency, then heaven and earth will have 4 blockages. So the soil that is representing earth is actually where the yin comes from. So the heaven, which is in opposition to heaven. So heaven is the source of the yang power in the air, in the movement of the clouds, in the movement of the components in the air, actually. So the heaven, while the heaven emphasizes movement, the earth emphasizes, grounding and nurturing and stillness. That's why anything that's in contact with soil or with water bodies or beside the soil is actually a place of yin, in the place of yin. And that's why he's saying that there is something that is constructing a yin environment. But then there is also the yin that's representing the invisible side of life, which is the germ, which is the sprout that hasn't gone out of the earth and hasn't been viewed or perceived. So this is the other yin that's within the yin as the soil or the earth. So the invisible within the earth, which is the yin within yin. And the yang within yin is when it comes out of the soil, and then you can see, oh, actually there is a potency that has been accumulating underneath the soil, and now it's been discovered. And this is why the Huangdi Neijing emphasizes the cultivation of the unseen or the invisible, because once it's out, actually, it's already taught to change a lot of the conditions that it accumulated in a very earlier stage. So let's see what this kind of discourse on the yin can help us to rethink our interpersonal relations. And there's one obvious example is interpersonal relations between, the female and the male persons. And there is obviously a technological aspect involved. As we mentioned, care of the self or nourishing life is a kind of bodily practice. Since it's a practice and since it evolves the body, it requires us to cultivate or to hone a certain type of skill. And so we would like to use the name Shu to encompass all these various skills that we can use when cultivating the yin-potency in our daily life. And one of the techniques that should be mentioned in here is the sexual intercourse between the male person and the female person. Remember that in Foucault, we actually didn't see any self-mastery techniques coming from the female person, because what we can see in ancient Greek self-mastery discourses are how the female should emulate, should imitate the male in order to train herself to be, more dominant of her desire and of her person, etc. But in the Chinese philosophical discourses, the yin actually is the predominant master of self-mastery or of self-caring, self-nourishing. So there is a quote from the Taoism handbook. The yin trigram can, or water, enclosed a solid yang line. So it's a line that doesn't have any broken parts. That's the yang diagram, which is real fire, yang within yin. And the yang trigram, li, or fire, encloses a broken yin line, which is the real water. So sorry for not having the time to put up the trigram of can, water, and the trigram of li, fire, onto the PPT. But the basic idea is, in the trigram of water, actually you have in the middle of the trigram a solid yang line. So this means that even within water, as the character, as the symbol of water, you see that there is fire lying within the core, actually, of this character. This means that even water, a material or an energy that is regarded as the most yin, as the most feminine in Chinese thought, it has in the middle of it, in the core of it, a real fire, a real solid yang line. And then vice versa. So in the fire trigram, you have the broken yin line. This tells a lot about the dynamics between a female person and a male person in the Chinese philosophical narratives. While the kan, water, represented the female who contains the yang element inside, and therefore it is faster for women to be transformed to longevity or immortality than for men. So we can see that it's not about, categorizing the female into one specific type of material or substance, but is about seeing that the female person has a capacity due to, these attribution of potentials and qi of yin in her person, in her body, in her entire being, that the yang person actually constantly needs the help of the yin person, or needs guidance from the yin person to be a better self, to be achieving longevity alongside with the female person. And it's also about how the female person actually obtains or is possessing this real fire or real yang within herself. So she's not entirely composed of yin energy either. So this is about not, categorizing one sex or one gender into one substance of yin or yang, but to be aware of the, the sophisticated and the dynamic, flexible patterns of being in both the female and the male. So in sexual intercourses, well, this is perhaps the most exciting part of this presentation. The male person should refrain from ejaculation to prevent the leaking of the yang body fluid, and for the female to have multiple orgasms to release yin body fluids, and for the male to gather the yin they lack. This is like a battle between fire and water for the male to accumulate more yin energy. It's like a battle, but nothing like perhaps that between Socrates and his disciple. Let's see what a very famous text on Chinese sexual yoga says about this. In engaging the enemy, a man should regard her as so much tiles or stone, and himself as gold or jade. When his jing sperm is aroused, he should immediately withdraw from her territory. One should mount a woman as if riding a galloping horse with rotten reins, or as if fearful of falling into a deep pit lined with knife blades. If you treasure your jing, your life will have no limit. So this is coming from Art of Bedchamber, the Chinese sexual yoga classics, including women's solo meditation. There are also some other very famous texts about how should the male person or the female person engage in sexual practices so that the practice would be beneficial or nourishing for both parties' well-being in the long run. It's a practice that engages not only with the other person, but also with the environment of the chamber. That's why the location is important, as well as the temporality. So the timing of the practice is also important. So a lot of these texts can echo with Foucault's writing on history of sexuality, especially in book 2. But only the difference lies, as we can see, in the fact that it's a training for the male person to obtain more yin energy through the repression, perhaps through the control. So there is a way of control in here, a dynamic of control in here, refraining from ejaculation. So so the timing is very important for this techniques of gathering the yin-potency to attain longevity. So the male person should train herself to be, prolonging his ejaculation, and so to help the yin, the female person to accumulate more yin power through the intercourse. So we can see that it's not really about how happy or how pleased the male part is. It's actually the opposite. It's actually depending on how a male can make a female part or partner obtain pleasure in the process. So the pleasure is very helpful actually for both parties, but especially for the male parties achieving the accumulation of the yin. Oh, I also want to mention one thing about this photo that I attached here is coming from Hong Lou Meng, so the mansion, the Dream of Red Mansion as one of the novels. And I would like to point out that this kind of skill or techniques of yin-potency, of gathering yin-potency, do not only limit themselves to what happens within the chamber, but also what happens before walking into the chamber. As you can see, the heroine is actually characterized as very, weak and feminine and even passive in many regards. But then it constantly is about how the male character, the hero, is trying to engage with her and try to get more, yin potency from her. And so we can also see that the character themselves are not fixed gender, because sometimes we can see the hero as being very, very feminine in a lot of cases. And this is actually a way of projecting the male person as more fluid, as in the traditional discourse that tries to separate the two as different categories. So lastly, I would like to move on to nourishing life as a government strategy. Previously, I've spent some time on, talking about techniques at the level of, interpersonal relation, especially relation between different sexes. But now I would like to move on to the notion of governmentality, and how this can actually provide another kind of perspective to the notion of government of self and others in Foucault. So governing with yin implies a pre-reflective mode of knowledge. As we can see, Foucault tries to emphasize the pre-reflective mode by emphasizing the bodily aspect of Diogenes' practice of truth, saying that truth is not about what we say, right? It's about what we show, maybe what we do, what we how our gestures actually have a meaning. But here in the course of nourishing life, one should intentionally switch from immediate and visible spectrum of phenomena to the background and its implicit patterns, namely a cognition of relation to the surroundings in both natural and socio-political terms. So here it's not only about how we approach the other in our own bodily dynamics or skills, but also about our epistemological shift from focusing on the subject, focusing on subjectivity either of the self or of the other person, to this background, that this environment that encompasses all these different types of people or different types of being. And you can look at the painting on the right side, that is quite representative of, the shanshui hua, the paintings of mountains and water in classical Chinese traditions, in that you always see, not always, maybe there are exceptions, but you tend to see in those paintings very few traces of people, or rather maybe symbols of human habitations in the photo, in the painting, but they are normally very, very, very minimal, and even to the point of invisible, compared to the vast space of emptiness, or the vast space that were generated by the contours of the mountains and the dynamics of the water. So in this kind of aesthetic point of view, you can actually detect an epistemological difference between the Chinese and the Western perspectives of the human environment relation. In this Chinese perspective, actually, we see we minimize actually the human agency in relation to the broader context where actions were taken, where decisions were made. So such cognitive power in shifting to the environment and the context, whether social or natural, lies in the capacity to interpret strategically one's relationship with the environment, including those who are around, which or who are never termed as other or the other, others or the other. So I think the idea is quite elucid. It means that we think of, or we in terms of like Chinese philosopher, think of the human relations in terms, not in terms of like combat between individuals on a such or on an affair that always only implicates the humankind, but also on an affair that actually need to take into consideration of all the factors that are related to the human. There is also this triad between the 天地人, so the heaven, the earth, and the people or the human. In that temporality, 天时, so good timing, for example, 天时, is always regarded or relatively considered in relation to the location. So 地利, yeah, the location should be right. Otherwise, it will be a bad decision to make, if we're back to act in such a time, in such a place. But then the temporality and the spatiality should be also considered in relation to social surroundings, 人和. So without the condition of a socio-political condition, then you can't really make things happen. So this is another perspective of looking at the background and looking at the context of a certain political decision. So I'd like to also uplift this proposition by relating this to a specific type of technique that is also called the yin, but with another character, yin as dependent or reliance, as opposed to yin in terms of the non-present or the more feminine. So there's a quote from Huainanzi: sages can be yin, so yin as feminine or weak, and they can be yang, they can be weak, and they can be strong. In tempo with the times, they are active or still. In accordance with inner substance of things, they establish merit. So unlike the ancient Greek sages who care for themselves and the city around them through combat among themselves, for combat against himself or herself and combat with the other human agencies, the Chinese sages in antiquity address various forms of relations in terms of yin. So yin as the character of reliance or dependence. So dependence doesn't seem like a very positive term in European languages, especially in ancient Greeks. Even when Socrates and Alcibiade was engaging in that, dynamic erotic relations, no one wants to be reliant on the other and to be dependent on the other. They all want to be the subject, right, of their action. I have an example that's the opposite. So Yu, the great, so Da Yu, is famous as one of the sages in prehistorical time that governs the water, so 治水. So he is appointed by his emperor at that time, and then later on he actually became the emperor after this great achievement in political governance. So Yu governs the water, appointed by Rao in prehistorical times, and he actually was trying to think of a way to redirect water instead of fighting against the water, the force of water, like what his father did. So his father Gun was also appointed to govern the water before him, but was executed because of the failure of his political decision, which was to build dikes and strong dams to push the water against, to stop the water from flowing into the living space of the villagers, for example. And then Yu, actually, as the son of Gun, actually uses another way to govern the water, or to deal with this immense flood on the Yellow River, which is directing the water, and to let the waters flow according to their natural tendencies and the contours of the terrain. So the great Yu the Great also dredged channels as outlets for torrential waters as irrigation to distant farmlands. So what he did was actually the opposite of claiming agency in relation to nature or in relation to environment. What he's doing is trying to let the vital conditions, so the spatial environment, the spatiality of the terrain, and the temporality, so what time would the water be higher and what time would be lower, decide his own actions. So he would, observe first, and then to guide this natural force into serving the purpose of agriculture, instead of destroying the plants and crops and the villages. So in this case, actually, Yu uses the notion of yin, uses the techniques of yin to actually master the governance of waters in his own example. And this way of, yielding agency to nature, yielding decision to the environment, is another type of techniques that are very, very precious when it comes to decision making in political context. So here comes the conclusion of this talk. I would like to really, I would say, acknowledge the contribution of Foucault to, bringing up this notion of care of the self in ancient Greek philosophy. But then this notion of care of the self, with a very strong Socratic tendency, tends to be limited to self-mastery in a virile type of combat with one's desires and notions. And the government of the self, that's derivative of this notion of care, also emphasizes the formation of a rational subject to be the governing citizen, to be the governing agency as well. And thus excluding the female or the feminine from socio-political relations. But this can be further developed if we look at, the Chinese philosophy of Yinyang, and take into consideration a less virile perception of care in terms of nourishing life, so yangsheng, that was basically all the practices that we talk about could be bracketed by the notion of yangsheng, especially with a focus on nurturing the non-present, the dark, the pre-reflective yin-potency. And so it's all about how we can measure our actions in accordance to this interplay between the yin and yang, and also in the needs of, gathering, nurturing of the yin-potency, which is oftentimes much neglected in compared to the yang power, which is more visible and attractive to a lot of the people, including myself. So this is the end of my presentation, and I hope that my talk has brought you something to think about today. So I'm just gonna stop sharing. Oh, I don't know how to stop.
I think you successfully stopped sharing.
Okay, great.
Okay, so thank you very much. We appreciate the talk a lot. And everybody's clapping virtually because it sounds weird when you clap out loud on Teams, it turns out. But I figured that I would give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions if they have some. So if you have a question, raise your hand. And if you're being slow in raising your hand, maybe I will ask the first question, and then see if that convinces other people too. So I guess that my question is, sexuality is very heterosexual in this story. So what if I'm interested in non-heterosexual sexuality in this framework, or is it not possible?
Yeah, obviously, I think the example that I'm using are tend to be more focused on heterosexual relations. One of the reasons is that those kind of relations tend to be quite lacking in Foucault's narratives about self-mastery, where the women or the female actually plays no role or no part in the self-combat or in either the training for temperance. So the intention was to try to bring in the female part into the perspective of the readers and see actually the female do contribute a lot in ancient Chinese philosophy, especially to the idea of like, nourishing life, proceeding to longevity, etc. But then if we want to look at more like less sexual relations in those kind of narratives or philosophical discourses, there are texts actually that talk about men-men relation. I'm not aware of female-female relations, so, but then I'm pretty sure that there are texts already that encompass, the main man-man erotic relations. But then this is a bibliography kind of limit of the project at the moment. But on a theoretical level, I think the theory does not have to be only geared toward interpreting heterosexual or interpersonal relations. As we can see, the yin-yang are not substance, right? They are not natural substance, even though they can be seen as concrete forces of nature, represented by water, by fire, and also by, in different degrees, by the wood and the soil, etc. So in themselves, the yin yang as paradigm of thinking has no preference for heterosexual or homosexual relations, and even within the relations that we just described between a man and a woman, we can see that the man, by trying to gather more yin-potency, actually is making himself, tilting towards the spectrum of the feminine already. So this kind of interplay between the male and the female are in no way consolidating the heterosexual labels or the heterosexual categorization of relationships. Instead, is actually breaking down the limit of what we call heterosexual. Is a relationship between men and women automatically be regarded as heterosexual? So I think, it's trying to break down those kind of solid limits of what we can call homosexual or heterosexual.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Do members of the audience have more questions? Kavita.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk. I found the comparative approach really interesting. I was kind of wondering about this concept of nurturing the non-present. I mean, do you see this sort of conception of the yin as something that would lead to women's more participation in the socio-political sphere, or conversely, does it kind of actually support the exclusion of women from political life?
Thank you so much. This is a very, very interesting question and very engaging as well. And in the spirit of strategy, right? What's the right kind of strategy, even if we already take into account the yin as a non-present? And so first of all, I think I would regard the yin potency as something that we need to shift our focus on. So there is already a requirement for, on the epistemological level, that we need to look at the less visible side of society and the more marginalized part of human life that we normally wouldn't define as the public sphere, right? So it's about digging out what are excluded from the visible part of public life. And normally it's the domestic, is the household, is, you know, the child carrying part of life that we tend to view as private, as the unseen, as the impossible to be exposed side of life. And that already, I think, is powerful shift of knowledge, right? So we're deciding where to look at. I think that even though the yin is something, you know, the yin as a metaphor for any kind of more feminine way of being, or you know, or the role that the women play maybe in the family or in society, as normally not as visible as the man. But we actually, there is a requirement for us to look at the yin, actually, to look at, to observe and to rediscover what the value of the yin is and how we can take advantage of that value. So I think it does not prevent, you know, women to sort of come out of come into the spotlight at all. It's the opposite. It's actually encouraging women to claim for what they've been doing and what they have been being actually as a person, and to claim the value of what they're contributing to society and to the family.
Thanks, it's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much for the question.
Are there other questions or comments or discussion to be had? Okay, so I'm going to ask one more one-off question and then see if the audience has another one, and if not, then we'll just have my one more question. I'm wondering, there's an interesting theory practice kind of thing going on here, right? Where, like, on one hand, you know, there's theorizing and thinking about the ways in which these balances are calibrated. On the other hand, like came up a couple of times, even in the small part of the philosophy of self-cultivation conference that I came to. There's a question of, like, all right, now I know this, so what do I do with it? Right, like, in some sense, and that's a way too simple way of phrasing it. But, like, what are the, like, ideally, how do we change how people think or live now that we've kind of done this theorizing, or do we not, I guess? Right,
that's quite a tough question, but coming from an expert in politics and international relations, it doesn't surprise me. Right, because the philosophers are all in the clouds, right? We are all, like, thinking about how this world should be and what we should do. But when it comes to the actual, you know, motivation of changing the, you know, ongoing reality of perhaps social injustice, or perhaps, you know, the loss of voices of women, it's not easy based on what we have as currently as a situation, right? But I think the change of, just like I said in answering the previous question, by changing from an epistemological point of view, what people think of what a woman is about, or what the feminine is about, we actually are changing a whole dynamic of relations between individuals or between, you know, like agencies in society, and we're actually proposing another way of looking at the female person, of looking at reality through a less virile perspective. And I think that can contribute to a lot of different things, from, for example, through education to young boys. We shouldn't, you know, kind of discriminate the female or the more feminine aspects of living, or aspects of values or social values. So, for example, when we, I think as educators at higher education institutes, at universities, we do have that power, but I think the educative power lies in parents, and also in, you know, in primary schools or even earlier, when we're coming into a perspective of gender, or of, you know, roles that are attributed between men and women. I think the yin philosophy helps us to think of, not that women can also be strong, can also be, you know, young, and can also do a lot of things just like men, but also women have superior power in certain domains that men cannot do, or men are less capable of doing. And those domains would be more treasured and valued, as opposed to domains that are traditionally left for men to take care of. And also, I'm aware of, you know, how radical feminism is also trying to, some radical feminisms, like bell hooks, are trying to also like have this kind of narrative that are very you know, pro-feminine, and a especially like pro-black feminine category. But I think it's strategic actually to think of the feminine as something that's advantageous. We should not think of it as like stigmatizing or even stereotyping the female person, because either you look at it or not, there are stereotypes in reality, and probably unsaid, probably said. But I think the fastest and the most effective way of changing those stereotypes and changing the dynamics between female and male in society is by claiming with evidence that the female is superior in certain ways. And I do think that's a radical strategy. And I think it's a strategy because that is not the end goal that we try to achieve. It's something that is useful at the moment based on the political and social situations that we are in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sorry for the impossible question. People always ask me, and even though I'm a politics person, I don't have the answer, so I understand. And I really learned a lot from the presentation, and I really appreciate it. And it doesn't seem like we have any more questions for right now, so maybe we should stop the recording and thank Manhua very much, and let you all know that the recording will be up on our YouTube channel within the next month or so, and that we really, really appreciate your attendance and Manhua's talk. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending this talk.